Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Mike Klipstein. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity. I know we tried this in the past and it didn't work out, but I'm happy to be here today.
Yeah, we've been trying to get you on for a little bit, and finally the stars aligned. So, for folks that don't know you or your background, do you mind telling us a bit about your background and what you're up to now?
Sure. So currently I'm a senior public policy advisor at Baker Donelson, a law firm in DC that does work with companies plus up on the Hill to get legislation that's favorable for cybersecurity efforts. In my past, I'm a refugee from the Army, so I've worked national level cyber for well over a decade now between U.S. Cyber Command, NSA when it was still TAO, the offensive arm of NSA, led the national mission team, the offensive team for Cyber National Mission Force, built 2 national level defensive teams to protect critical infrastructure, did a PhD in Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, which, by the way, I have to give a plug to them because they made it easy, and easy is a relative term in PhDs. But my dissertation got pulled into what is now the program of record for cyber command and control for the DoD, even before I even graduated, so it made my defense even easier. Worked at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, doing outreach to companies in international governments. Worked at the White House as Director of International Cybersecurity Policy. Here I am now.
So just a couple of years of experience doing a couple things. No,
I've done one, maybe 2 things.
Just a couple of things. Yeah. Well, you have such a great background, and what I wanted to ask you about too is, in addition to what you're doing now in your senior policy advisory role, you also are part of, you mentioned the PhD, and you're also part of, academic institutions and teaching and being a doctoral chair, and which is, sort of how we kind of came across each other as just Cap Tech. Can you talk a little bit about maybe why you wanted to be involved in the academic side, why you wanted to get involved in research, and maybe how you think that plays into sort of what you've been doing on the policy side as well?
So I've always wanted to give back to the community because the community was good to me, and I had a lot of good mentors along the way. And as I was coming up through the cyber community and hitting different roles, the thing that I kept coming into over and over again was there were people making decisions that didn't understand cyber or how the internet worked or anything else like that. So I had the opportunity when I was at the Army Cyber Institute to actually create and teach courses for Columbia's graduate programs in their School of Public Policy. And so the goal there was to teach future policymakers at the conversational level how the internet works, what the cyber attacks were, and stuff like that, so they can make more informed and actually good policy. I turned around and did that at Hopkins also for their MBA program, so business leaders could make good decisions about this kind of stuff. I always felt that this was important so that when a policy person or a business manager starts entering these conversations with a technologist, they don't get relegated out of the room within the first 15 seconds because they can't handle the conversation. They may not have the deep technical expertise, but at least they can be part of the conversation. They can turn around to decision makers if they're not one themselves and articulate what the technologists are saying, and turn around back to the technologist and articulate what the end goals or business decisions are going to be to figure out how to meld the two together. Basically try to make everyone better at this kind of stuff instead of having garbage policy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's one of the reasons, why I was so interested in academic and research and sort of straddling both sides. So it was like, we can bring some of the research that we have on the academic side back into the cyber community and take a lot of the current problem sets that we have in cyber and take them back into academia and try to actually research those. So sort of bringing those conversations together. I wanted to ask you on that sort of more technical side too. We're seeing a ton about software supply chain security that's super hot, and our wonderful host Chris Hughes just wrote a book on that that we'll be chatting about later. But I'm curious about software supply chain security. We're seeing zero trust, AI, ML, like everywhere. But we're not necessarily having that conversation when we're talking about protecting our critical assets, our critical infrastructure, very specifically, because IT, OT they are different. I mean, we talk about IT, OT convergence, but critical infrastructure is needs separate policies in place. So why do you think we haven't seen as much talk about this in sort of that critical infrastructure space?
OT has often been ignored for a very long time. The focus has always been on IT, how to make it more resilient, the features that are involved, the antivirus updates, everything's been there because that's where the attackers typically were. Everything had ignored up until the last couple of years, OT technologies. Now that attackers have figured out that OT can have a lot more widespread effects, that's a huge playground because there's companies out there that don't know where all their OT devices are. They may be out of date because the manufacturer quit supporting them 5 to 10 years ago, potentially, and they're vulnerable. Additionally, if I can shut down a nuclear power plant, hypothetically, or disrupt the electrical power generation and distribution from one, I can have a lot more widespread effects than what I can with a single IT device. When I start looking at other situations like Maritime as an example, there's a big convergence between IT and OT. There's IT devices that are used for OT purposes at times and vice versa. And so there's a lot of problems with some of this stuff. When we start talking about AI and ML, there's stuff that's been done in the past. So when you look at David Brumley and Mayhem, who won the Dark Grand Challenge in 2016, some of this stuff's been done as far as AI and ML. I don't know why it's not being talked about more. I mean, there's some limitations to AI and ML, obviously, where we start looking at the training data, when we start looking at out of the normal user expectations as far as what the user does and stuff like that, so we don't get false positives. But there's stuff that should be done. There are companies out there like Galvanic that comes off the top of my head that is looking at OT technologies and stuff like that. There's some of the national labs that are looking at OT technologies and how to protect them as well also. I think that's an area that's ripe for research and development right now.
Yeah, it's honestly a little scaring in the sense that you talked about, how OT's been historically kind of overlooked until recently, considering how much of our critical infrastructure, are key things that we depend on as a society, whether from a civilian perspective or a national security perspective tied to that. So I am glad to see it's getting more traction and more focus. And I know it was emphasized in things like the National Cyber Strategy in terms of critical infrastructure and things like that. One thing I wanted to ask you about, you brought Maritime, and I know that you contributed to the National Maritime Cybersecurity Plan. Why is it so critical to move that forward in terms of maritime activities and cybersecurity? And, given the plan came out in 2020, how do you feel we're doing, from the time the plan came out till now?
So I led the work across the interagency for that, and I was able to get it out the door before the administration changed. Thank God for small favors. But let me take a little excerpt out of the very beginning of the plan to kind of signify the importance of why this was needed, because up until this point, nothing like this existed. The United States is a maritime nation consisting of an integrated network of 25,000 miles of coastal and inland waterways, 361 ports, 124 shipyards, and more than 3,500 maritime facilities, 20,000 bridges, 50,000 federal aids to navigation, and 95,000 miles of shoreline that are interconnected with critical highways, railways, airports, and pipelines. The maritime transportation system contributes to 1/4 of all the United States gross domestic product, or approximately $5.4 trillion. That's ripe for attacks. So when we start looking at this, there's obviously the national economic functions that come into play here. We saw what that looks like when shipping gets slowed down or offloading of the ships during COVID. People were struggling with that, and that was kind of artificially made, for lack of a better term, because there wasn't a protracted adversary. When we look at the 2017 NotPetya attacks that the Russians released, there were reports such as the Port of New York, that were actually manifesting cargo on and off ships with cardboard and markers, these big Maersk ships. Speaking of Maersk, if you read the Wired magazine article that they did on the NotPetya attack, which I used to make my students read because it was probably the most well-written article out there about that, Maersk came within one device of losing all their data globally. It only happened to be saved because there was a powder outage in Ghana less than 10 minutes before NotPetya came rolling through. So they had to force a dude to get on a plane and go to Ghana and retrieve the device so they could rebuild their networks from there. Think about that. Maersk has a larger market cap than some companies' GDP. So from a national security perspective, when the United States projects power outside the nation to a foreign land, the soldiers, sailors, airmen typically go on planes. Well, not the seamen, though. Obviously, they got their own ships. But all the logistics to maintain a fight, your tanks, your howitzers, your food, your water, your ammunition, all your medical supplies, everything comes by ship. So if the stuff can't get out of port, what's going to happen to a power projection? So you have a national security aspect to this as well also. There are 6 strategic seaports run by the DoD, but there's 17 others that are civilian owned and operated that are considered strategic seaports for supporting a national crisis. One of the things I was looking at when I was at the NSC is large Chinese gantry cranes. There's only 3 manufacturers of large gantry cranes in the world. 2 of them are Chinese. At the time, we still didn't know what they were communicating back, how encrypted and how well encrypted were the protocols for the cranes. Can I make the crane do things it was never intended to do, or could, God forbid, the Chinese do it? In 2020, 26 more large Chinese gantry cranes got put into strategic seaports, such as Norfolk, LA, Long Beach, Seattle, places like that we care about. We have foreign ports like Antwerp and Rotterdam that are almost fully automated at this point. So what happens when these ports get shut down? I may be able to get out of my own port, but what happens when I get to the foreign port and can't get out of the port there? Again, national security aspects interwoven with national economic functions.
Yeah, you said so many things that really I could take us on like an entire diatribe or side conversation on these, like the national security and economic implications of, having a distributed, a global manufacturing base where we consume goods from a lot of other places and we depend on them for, those resources. And then you made me remind myself of, during COVID, seeing, ships circling out, couldn't get into the port. And then the downstream ramifications that had on us and as citizens wanting to get materials, for our lives, to keep our personal lives going, and whether it's medications or just leisurely things we needed.
Or sriracha. There was a sriracha shortage.
Yeah, they're messing with sriracha. Things are getting serious. But no, and then you touched on also like the equipment, right? We embed this equipment that's manufactured in other places, and we have no real insight into, what's been done to it before it got here. How much can we trust it? Can it have implications down the road to do things that we didn't intend for it to do during maybe a military time, conflict, for example. So really, really scary stuff. And then, pivoting a little bit from the maritime aspect, you point out, just how prevalent and how important these ports are for our national security and economy. You've also been involved with Freedom for Democracies, I think it is, or Freedom for, Freedom Foundation for Defense of Democracies as an organization. We recently had Mark Montgomery on the show too. And I know that organization and you and him have been making the case that space needs to be designated as a critical infrastructure as well. You want to touch on that, in regards to kind of moving from sea to space? We've seen, for example, at the start of the Ukraine conflict, we saw the importance of providing internet connectivity from space, for example, right? To keep nations safe and secure, for example. So I'm curious your thoughts there.
So sure. So space is the forgotten infrastructure that everyone takes for granted. I say that because it provides the timing for our cell phones. It provides the timing for our transactions with banks and in the financial markets. It also provides a lot of timing for other critical infrastructure, whether it's water power generation, distribution, whether that is the lights in traffic intersections. All kinds of stuff rely upon space assets. Then you have the telecommunications aspect, the long haul things around the world, which some of the internet still travels over space links. You have NOAA and NASA's efforts to track climate change and weather change so we can have accurate predictions of when a hurricane's coming and where is it going to. So in 2021, Space Foundation put out a report that identified $447 billion in global revenue for space in 2020. That was 5 times more than the revenue generated by the railway sector and twice what was predicted by the airlines in 2021. When you start looking at the definitions and legislation of what critical infrastructure is, it describes that has both a national economic and national defense function, and is so serious that the nation would be in threat if they fell, that's a space asset or critical infrastructure. Space is a critical infrastructure asset at that particular point. It's time that we start recognizing how interwoven it is to all the other critical infrastructure sectors right now.
It's such a good point, and I think such an interesting perspective, like something we clearly need to be talking about. So, on that same note, we have the Space Force. Do you think that we need a Space Cyber Command or some other branch that needs to be responsible specifically for space security?
So that's wrapped up into Space Force already for the government's stuff. No one regulates or oversees the commercial side of things right there. And even Space Force doesn't have purview over all the government's stuff. So NOAA satellites, as an example, they can, if invited, but they don't have purview over it as a quote unquote regulator. We definitely have some issues there. I think that there's some challenges in the environment right now, and in some ways it's more of a wild west than what the internet is. Just people haven't realized it yet, even though our adversaries are starting to wake up to that realization quite quickly and capitalizing on it.
And Mike, I wanted to ask you a quick question, if I could. You kind of emphasized this a couple of times, once on the maritime front and once with the space front. And we've heard this before that, a large portion of the, actually more than obviously half of the critical infrastructure in the United States, whether we're talking space, maritime, industrial control systems, and so on, are owned by private sector entities. Mm-hmm. And there's always a push, or a conversation of, regulating those entities more, but also not trying to, overburden the private sector or stifle innovation and those kind of things. And I know it's like a long-winded answer, but I'm just curious your perspective on how we walk that fine line of, regulating these entities that own this critical infrastructure, but also not overburdening the private sector, basically.
So I think there needs to be some form of regulation. What does that look like? I don't know. But the first thing I would point to, though, is for consideration is we have Space Policy Directive 5 that talks about cybersecurity risks in space. And I think that needs a drastic overhaul now. The reason I say that, it talks in vague terms of what risk is in space, and it relies upon, as I phrase to some of my students when I talk to them, warm, fuzzy tummy feelings. And as a quantitative guy, that ain't me. I think that there needs to be some kind of a NIST standard put out that supports Space Policy Directive 5 so that we can actually point to it as an authoritative document and say, this is the standard you should be held to. And I'm going to, as a regulator, I'm going to hold you to that standard. But more than that, this can't be a U.S. approach. This needs to be an international approach, because the norms for cyberspace just don't exist right now. Everything ties back to the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Space in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, or the Convention on Liability in Space, which dates from 1972. Neither one of those envisioned commercial space. The most recent document that came out was the Artemis Accords out of NASA. I want to say it's in 2020 or 2021 off the top of my head. Now, the problem with that is it's for NASA and other governments' versions of NASA. It has nothing to do with commercial enterprises such as Starlink, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and none of those companies. It has nothing to do with them. Now, it's for the governmental side. So looking at a redo of the UN 1967 Outer Space Treaty would be the best way to establish international norms that fit today's environment, today's paradigm. That's what we need. It's what the administration should try to leverage its power at the UN for. Internal regulation is only going to drive U.S. entities outside of the country so they can have free playground there.
It's interesting when we're talking about policy and having maybe some sort of legislation or document from NIST, something like that, to sort of say, hey, we at least we have one updated guidance and documentation, but a good place for people to start and say, hey, this is just sort of the foundational components we need. I think one of the things I knew we were going to have this conversation is I was really thinking about, the amount of time that it may take to get, some sort of secure configuration in place, and to even determine what secure configuration looks like for space cybersecurity. I certainly don't know. But my biggest concern is really incident response, because it's going to take time to figure out, what are the best, configs and things to put in place. But really, what are we going to do if the systems go down? And I think that's the biggest thing to think about. So what do you think are some places to start when it comes to incident response, or sort of how can we even handle something like that?
So for incident response of IT systems, we kind of know what that looks like. It changes a little bit every day because the environment changes every day. Where I think the heavy lift needs to occur is in OT technologies, those operational technologies where machines control other machines. That's where we need to go. Going back to what I said earlier about it being the forgotten landscape. Again, you have companies that don't know where all their OT systems are. You have stuff that is still in place, even though it should have been life cycled years ago, because it's not broken. So why replace it? I think an attacker can have a larger effect in a OT attack than what they can typically with an IT attack. It's just a matter of what they want to do and where do they want to hurt the United States or a company or whatever the case may be. And like I said earlier, up until recently, research into protecting OT hasn't existed. It's just been in the last couple of years.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's definitely an area ripe for disruption, both from a regulatory and kind of policy perspective, and obviously from a malicious actors perspective, which is terrifying. One thing I wanted to ask you too is you previously served as director of international cybersecurity policy. And you touched on that in your opening, kind of about your background. We recently saw the national cyber strategy come out, and it had a big emphasis on international partners and things of that nature. I'm curious your perspective. You talked about, how we have this global interconnected economy and national security system, basically, due to our reliance on other countries, whether partners or, obviously near peer adversaries, things like that. Can you tell us a bit about your experience in the international cybersecurity space and, where you see things headed?
So when I went to do the National Maritime Cybersecurity Plan, I didn't want something just to come out of the White House that everyone's going to ignore because they didn't hear about it or whatever the case may be. So what I did was I started looking at the entire ecosystem and bringing them into play. And what I mean by that is I went to create NIST standards and brought NIST into the table. From there, I brought in shippers, port facility owners and operators, cruise line operators, and most importantly, I brought in the maritime legal people and I brought in the maritime legal associations, because this way we have soup to nuts ecosystem of everyone involved. I say that because up until now, nothing has existed for insurance companies to actually charge premiums against in a, I don't want to say factual way, but in an articulate way. It goes back to those warm, fuzzy tummy feelings. By having standards assessed against them by NIST, if they ever get finished creating them, then they can hold premiums up against that and say, this is what we're going to hold you to as for your premiums. If you don't do it, we're going to raise your premiums. Similarly, the Maritime Legal Association was there so that if a company is breached, go back to the premiums and go back to the NIST standards. Did you exercise due diligence? Now, invited all, like I said, the port owners and operators, the shippers, even cruise lines, so that they could have a part in, not just government saying, this is what a standard would look like for cybersecurity for OT systems and ports. I wanted everyone to have ownership of the problem and of the solution, not just foisting a solution on them that may not make sense because a small committee of people sequestered away north of DC decided it was the best thing to do. I wanted to, like I said, I wanted all these entities to have ownership of the problem.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know that there's been in other areas too, like NIST does a ton of working groups with different community partners, and they're working on a lot of, private public partnership type stuff. And I think that's really the way to go, right? To get all those different and unique perspectives to come in and say, hey, have you thought about this? Hey, have you.
Can I add one thing?
Oh, yeah.
I invited in foreign governments. I invited in foreign academia as well also. I wanted, because maritime connects us all, I wanted everyone to have the ability to come to the table, because if NIST is going to say one thing in the United States, NIST becomes the global standard, for lack of a better term. A lot of ISO standards are copied off of NIST or modified off of NIST. But you can be sure sure that the Germans, the Japanese, the British, and whomever else who owns a port are going to start moving to those standards in their own interest if the United States moves to those standards. So again, I want everyone to be part of the problem and have ownership of it, but I also wanted everyone to be part of the solution so they had a say.
I think that's so great to have so many different perspectives. And you're right, it does become a global standard. Everybody uses it. So it's important to have different voices and different perspectives. Well, I want to change tracks, totally, completely different subject. Before I take us to our last question, we got to talk about this a little bit, but I saw that, you went to University of Maryland, and I was curious because it's summertime and I know I'm going to be having crabs. So are you getting crabs this summer or?
Oh yes, I will. So whenever I'm up in the Baltimore area, there's a place in Federal Hill called LQ Steamers on 4th Avenue. It has the best crab cakes out there, hands down. There's other places people say are good. They just use too much filler. LQ Steamers, no. Get the broiled ones, by the way.
Good. I felt like I had to ask the question to like another Maryland person. Well, before I take it, so I'm going to take that back. Before I take us to our last question, is there anything you have going on, anything you're working on, anything you wanted to discuss or tell people where else they can find you?
So obviously you can find me on LinkedIn. If God help you if you become one of my students, because I make people write multiple times to get it right. But yeah, I'm here at Baker Donaldson trying to serve the greater cybersecurity community.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, so that will then take us to our last question, which is, what does cyber resiliency mean to you?
To me, cyber resiliency is to be able to survive a massive incident that also results in a whole a whole society effort, because this can't be just government's responsibility. Government can't fix everything, nor should government even try. Individual stakeholders, if you own a network, you have responsibility over your network also. Don't look for CISO, the DoD, or whomever else to come over the hills to save you. Now, if it's a nation-state attack, that's something different, but most of this stuff is not nation-state attacks. There's a reason why the Verizon breach report for over a decade has listed phishing as the #1 exploit out there. Ransomware, a lot of this stuff can be fixed with good cyber hygiene. So resiliency to me means you can survive an attack with your core business functions. You may have to involve a COOP plan or a disaster recovery plan, but that also means you should have the stuff, you should exercise it, you should dust it off every once in a while and review it to make sure it's still legitimate for the environment that you're currently in. All that stuff goes into the resiliency aspect. It's not just being able to survive, it's you have the mature processes in place for when things do happen, not if they happen.
Yep. I love that answer. It's perfect. I wanted to say a huge thank you, Mike, for joining us today. We got to talk about all things from the national cybersecurity strategy to maritime and space security and everything in between. Yeah. And crabs. I'm so glad we got to fit that in too. So thank you so much for joining us this week. That's going to take us out for this week, and we'll see everybody next week. Thanks, Mike.